joined now by the former International Development Secretary Andrew Mitchell and the former Shadow Home Secretary David Davies for the Conservatives, and from Labour Tessa Jowell, who was in the Labour cabinet that took Britain into Iraq. Andrew Mitchell, first, you said in the Commons earlier that you wanted the government to publish the evidence in full. Well, I put that to the Defence Secretary and he said pretty much there wasn't much more available. Does that make you think twice about backing any action?
No, I think it's very important that all the evidence is published that can be.
But he said there wasn't much more to publish.
Well, this is a moving scene, and there will be more evidence over the next days. There'll be stuff that comes back from the weapons inspectors, and there'll be stuff that the Americans are able to release. We're expecting the Americans to release further evidence tonight. My point is that a very sceptical British public won't accept politicians saying they've seen the evidence and that's enough. They need to hear themselves what the evidence is that would lead to military action by Britain. And that's because of the legacy of the Iraq War, and that's why it's so important this time.
Well, Tessa Jowell, you helped take the last government into the Iraq War. Are you more worried now by the absence of evidence or the absence of a UN Security Council resolution?
Well, both, but I also agree with Andrew. I think that all the available evidence should be published, and I think that however this concludes, it should be a decision of the House of Commons, and we're, I think, somewhere away from that conclusion. But it is important that the evidence published and that members of the House of Commons are therefore able to reach a conclusion based on all the available information.
David Davies, the lack of a dodgy dossier, though, is surely to be applauded.
Well, it's better not have a dodgy dossier, but it'd be useful to have a dossier of the evidence. And there's no reason for withholding it, frankly. I mean, normally with intelligence, you've got to be very careful, but frankly, in this area, the Americans are releasing intercepts. That's normally the holy grail. If they can release that, we can release anything. The fact of the matter is that as we stand here today, we haven't had a case for intervention. We do not know whether it was Assad who instructed the use of the nerve gas. We know the nerve gas attack happened, but we don't know that Assad instructed it. We don't know whether it was a rogue element in his forces did it. We don't even know if it's the rebels that did it. There's lots more to discover. And until we do that, we should not be attacking them.
Well, number 10 says that this delay in decision, the flip-flopping by the Labour leader, which I'll ask you about in a minute, they say this is all giving succour to Assad. No,
it's not. I mean, you always find governments wanting to rush into things. That was one of the problems in the Iraq War. We rushed in too quickly before we'd actually assess the evidence. Nothing's going to go away. We can take our time to assess it properly and then act with deliberation. While we're at it, working on the Russians, the Chinese and the Iranians too.
Well, the Labour leader, though, has flip-flopped on this, hasn't he?
Absolute nonsense.
Well, he came out on Tuesday and said the Labour Party would consider supporting international action. There was nothing about delaying weapons inspectors, more time.
Ed Miliband has set out, first of all, a very clear roadmap, and today 3 very clear tests. And the reason I think that there is distance between the government's motion, David Cameron's motion, and the Labour motion is the lack of specificity in the government motion. And actually, David Cameron was more forthcoming at the dispatch box. So the question is, if he could be more forthcoming at the dispatch box about the second resolution and so forth, why not in the motion? But the fact is that the discussions will continue, and I hope very much indeed that we will be able to get to a point where there is a House of Commons view on how we should proceed.
You're not going to get that UN resolution, though, that you say you'd like to have.
Well, you see, I think that David is right on this. I mean, I think that diplomatic engagement with Russia, we cannot see a UN which is paralysed by a permanent blocking minority in the Security Council. Otherwise, and you can't work around that, because otherwise, we are effectively, tearing up the UN Charter. So, you never say never in this business.
With your former international development hat on, do you buy the argument that humanitarian justification is enough legally?
Well, I think because of the reasons that Tessa gave, we are in an area which is quite new in international law. It's the responsibility to protect the work that Gareth Evans persuaded the Security Council to adopt in 2005. I'm absolutely clear that this is a responsibility to protect issue, the humanitarian catastrophe that's taking place, not only in Syria but also in Jordan and Lebanon, is one where the international community must respond. And in my opinion, if the evidence is there, if we're clear that these appalling weapons were used by the Assad regime, then the international community will have to take action, because not to do so would be far more risky than taking that action.
But that action has got to be deterrence. If it actually is proven, and if we get to that point, it's got to be deterrence. All the talk that the Americans are going in for, punishment, reprisal and so on, is actually outside the law. Let's be clear about that. The action is protection of life. That's what we're about. And if we get to that point, then we've got to be clear. We're protecting life, we're deterring further action. We're not trying to punish a regime.
Andrew Mitchell, the action's against the law.
No, I think that I agree largely with what David is saying. But what I'm saying at the end of the day, and I think this is an area where we don't agree, is that the risks of doing nothing, having these red lines having been crossed, if the evidence is clear about the Assad regime's involvement, it is more dangerous to do nothing than to take what I believe is the necessary international action.
Andrew Mitchell, David Davis, Tessa Jowell, thank you very much for joining me. We'll be back